Hi everyone. In this video we're going to look at Chapter 11, and Chapter 11 looks at experiments and observational studies and the difference between the two. With both observational studies and experiments, researchers are looking to investigate the relationship between two or more variables. And then, of course, they want to draw a conclusion. The type of conclusion that a researcher can draw will depend on the method that they use. So for both observational studies and experiments, they will have at least one explanatory variable and at least one response variable. With an observational study, the researcher is passively observing what is happening. They're collecting data. But with an experiment, the researcher is actively controlling the explanatory variable. Because an observational study is passive and there's no control, the best conclusion that can be drawn is that there's some kind of association between the variables. But just as we talked about in Chapter 7, anytime that you discuss an association, you have to be mindful that there can be some kind of lurking or confounding variables underneath. With an experiment, however, because the researcher is controlling the explanatory variables, they are then accounting for these lurking variables and therefore can determine a cause and effect relationship. There are two types of observational studies, a retrospective study and a prospective study. Think retro in the past, pro is in the future. With a retrospective study, the data already exists. It's already there, and the researcher is choosing their subjects to be part of the study, and then they're going into the past data and looking for associations. Sometimes with this type of study, there can be problems if there are incomplete historical records or if they're trying to use a subject's memory. With a prospective study, the researcher will identify the subjects and then they'll collect data on those subjects as time passes. So the data doesn't exist yet. So for example, a researcher might select a group of infants and then follow them from preschool throughout their K through 12 years and collect data. It can be difficult to do a prospective study if you have a large number of people. It's also expensive and very time-consuming. So here's a couple of examples. In this first one, it says a business student conjectures that the internet caused companies to become more profitable, since many transactions that were previously handled face-to-face could now be completed online. The student compares earnings from a sample of companies from the 1980s to a sample from the 2000s. So first, what type of study is this? Specifically, is this a retrospective study or a prospective study? Well, notice that the company is looking, or the student is collecting data from companies from the 1980s and 2000s, meaning that the data already exists. So this is a retrospective observational study. What's the explanatory variable of this study? Be careful here. I see some students who get this incorrect because they'll say it's the internet. The internet is not the explanatory variable. In fact, I would say that the internet that the student is looking at, well, there's only one internet, but that's what I mean, is the lurking variable underneath. So in this case, the student is collecting data based on the time, so the 1980s and 2000s, and then comparing that with the earnings of the company, which means that the explanatory variable is the time and the response variable are the earnings. If the profitability did increase, can the student conclude that the internet was the cause? Why or why not? No, because with an observational study, we can't determine cause and effect. The second example, it says multiple sclerosis is an autoimmune disease that strikes more often the further people live from the equator. Could vitamin D be a factor? Researchers compared vitamin D levels in blood samples from 150 U.S. military personnel who had developed MS with blood samples of nearly 300 who had not. The samples were taken on average 5 years before the disease was diagnosed. Those with the highest blood levels of vitamin D had a 62% lower risk of MS than those with the lowest levels. So even though the wording of this problem is all in the past, that's because the study is complete. But when you look at how the study was performed, they collected the blood samples on average 5 years before the disease was diagnosed, which means that they collected the blood samples and then observed the subjects to see whether or not they got MS. So when it says this says what are the subjects of the study, this would be the U.S. military personnel. What type of study is this? So again, they're taking the blood and then following the subjects. So this is a prospective observational study. The explanatory variable would be the vitamin D levels in the blood. And the response variable is going to be whether or not the subject got MS. Another misconception about these problems is that all of the variables need to be quantitative. It's not the case. We're only talking about types of studies. We're not actually getting into any kind of data here. We're just talking about being able to recognize a prospective study, a retrospective study, or an experiment. So the variables can be either quantitative or categorical. Talking about experiments. So remember that with an experiment, investigators will manipulate the explanatory variable. In fact, they will actively and deliberately manipulates the explanatory variable. We also say the explanatory variables are called factors. So usually when we're talking about an experiment, we call them factors. There can be more than one explanatory variable, and there can be more than one response variable with more complicated experiments. Another key thing that an experiment needs to have is that the experimenter needs to randomly assign subjects to treatment groups. So they'll be randomly assigning subjects to one or more groups. This diagram only has 2 groups. And then the groups will have different treatments of the explanatory variable. So by treatment, I just mean the level of manipulation of the explanatory variable. So for example, say a researcher is looking at caffeine and how it affects sleep. And say with group 1, the treatment is that they have 1 cup of coffee, and then they look at how long it takes for that person to fall asleep. And with group 2, they have 2 cups of coffee. So that would be the difference in the treatment, would be the amount of coffee. Or maybe group 1 doesn't have any coffee and group 2 has 1 cup, right? The treatment is just the difference. The random allocation that the researchers do will account for any lurking or confounding variables, because basically both of those, or not both of those variables, but those types of variables, those lurking variables, are going to be in both groups. So if there's still a difference in the response variable at the end, you know that it wasn't because of those lurking variables. If there's any kind of baseline group, like I kind of in my previous example I said, if they don't give coffee at all to group 1, that would be considered a control group or a placebo group. An experiment does not have to have a control group. Also, single blinding and double blinding. Single blinding means that the subjects don't know what group they're in, And double blinding means that the treatment administrator also doesn't know what group they're in. So for example, right now there's a lot of COVID vaccine experiments going on right now. There's obviously a placebo group, and then there's going to be a group that gets the vaccine. And there's probably more than one group. I don't know the full extent of the experiments. But single blinding would be that the person who's receiving the shot does not know if they're getting the placebo or the vaccine. Double blinding would mean that neither the subject getting the shot nor the person giving the shot knows which group they're in. Now, that does, still somebody knows, right? It's still being tracked in a computer system somewhere, but the administrator of the treatment doesn't know which group the subject is in. So two kind of quick examples here. For this first one, it says, to assess the effectiveness of a new method for teaching arithmetic to elementary school children, a simple random sample of 30 first graders were taught with a new method, and another simple random sample of 30 first graders were taught with a currently used method. At the end of 8 weeks, the children were given a test to assess their knowledge. So this is an example of an experiment where we have two treatment groups, and the treatment groups are given different teaching methods, and the children are randomly assigned to each group. With the next example, it says scientists reported the results of a study to determine whether a new drug is effective in reducing levels of virus in patients with HIV. The patients were divided into two groups, where one group was given the drug and the other group was given a placebo. In the group that was given the drug, 62% of the subjects had reduced levels of virus, but only 35% of the placebo group did. So the conclusion here is that because this study was an experiment, and because these percentages are so different, that we can conclude that the difference was actually due to the drug. I wanted to show this example because we're going to talk more about this when we get into Unit 3, but remember that when we're comparing samples, that we have a natural sampling variability. We saw that when we were doing simulations. So if the percentages between the groups are fairly close, it could be due to this just natural sampling variability. So if we had like 62% here and 58% here, it might just simply be due to the chance of that variability. But because these two percentages are so far off, because there's such a large difference, we would say that they're statistically significantly different. And therefore, the difference is probably due to the drug and not just chance. Okay, another example. It says, a pizza driver wants to increase the amount of money he receives in tips. During his next 40 deliveries, he flips a coin to decide whether or not to call the customer when he is 5 minutes away. He hopes that this bump in customer service will lead to a bump in tips. After 40 deliveries, he will compare the average tip percentage between the customers he called and those he did not call. Is this an experiment or an observational study? Explain. So we would say that this is an experiment because he is manipulating that explanatory variable. What is the explanatory variable? Well, the explanatory variable is that piece of whether he calls the customer when he's 5 minutes away or not. He's also putting these customers into, I pop up here, into random groups. He's randomly putting customers into these groups. So we have an experiment. The driver is randomly assigning participants and controlled a factor of the experiment. We kind of already said this. What are the explanatory or variable, or also called factor? And that would be the customer service, whether or not he's calling them when he's 5 minutes away. The response variable is going to be the tips, right? whether or not he's getting more tips when he calls. The subjects are the customers. And then, is this a blind study? And we would say yes, because the customers have no idea that they're even part of an experiment. Another example, athletes who suffered hamstring injuries were randomly assigned to one of two exercise programs. Those who engaged in static stretching returned to sports activity in a mean of 15.2 days faster than those assigned to a program of agility and trunk stabilization exercises. Is this an experiment or an observational study? Well, there's two different groups. They're being assigned to these groups, and it says randomly assigned to these groups, and the groups have different treatments, right? The treatments are the type of stretching or exercising that they're doing. So this would be an experiment. The factors of the experiment would be the type of exercises that they're doing. And then the response variable, be careful, the mean is part of the conclusion. So the response variable is the number of days it would take for the athlete to get back to their sports activity. What are the subjects or the experimental units? The subjects of the experiment are the athletes. We use the term experimental units when we're talking, usually when we're talking about doing an experiment that doesn't involve people. And then, is this a blind study? In this case, it's not a blind study because the subjects need to know which treatment group they're in, because their treatment group depends on the type of exercise that they're going to do. And then one last thing, actually, as I was making the slides for this chapter, I came across a study, this is very recent, it was just a couple of days ago, where they were describing an experiment. So this is the title of the article, and I have the website up here if you want to read the whole thing. But basically, in a small California city, there was a new young mayor, and he randomly chose, I think it was 150 families, maybe it was just people, 150 people, and he gave them $500 a month, every month for 2 years, with absolutely no strings attached. No drug tests, no work requirements, nothing. And people could use the $500 and just spend it as they saw fit. A group of researchers heard about this and also chose another group of people at random who were not receiving the payments and made some comparisons. They did find that the people who received the money did spend the money on essential items like food, home goods, utilities, and gas, so they didn't just waste money. And they also found, which something that I thought was pretty interesting, was that after a year, full-time employment among the recipients actually grew from 28% to 40%, which was more than twice the rate of the control group. So more than twice the rate of the people who were not receiving that amount of money. So actually having a small income, guaranteed income, actually led to better employment. The researchers also said that the money had a significant impact on recipients' mental health. So I just thought that was interesting if you wanted to read up on a real-life experiment that is currently going on. All right, if you have any questions on Chapter 11, let me know.